Hello everybody, this is Manu-S. Welcome to another Eternal set review. It's time to start the card-by-card set review for the new set Omens of the Past that has been released last Friday. And as I promised, I'm gonna review the entire set card by card and give my feedback on them the same way I did for the Empty Throne back when I started making content. Alright, so let's dive right in. First off, we have Fire Main Cup. I already said most I have to say about this card in the spoiler review. A 1/1 for 1, nothing too flashy, dealing a damage only to an enemy unit, limits it since if they don't have a unit we basically only get a 1/1 for 1, but all in all it might be a decent option and constructed in some decks since it's really good against other smaller aggressive decks, potentially being able to trade 2 for 1. It's basically a worse Grenade and Drone in my eyes, and a potential sideboard option for tournament play for some decks against small aggressive decks. Quickly in draft, I think this card is probably not gonna be good because there's not enough good targets usually, and like the impact is very limited, but it might be an okay filler. And there's Forge Wolf that has been put into Omens of the Past for limited purposes, and yeah, this card is basically a terrible Fire Main Cup and unplayable in constructed and limited usually. In limited it can function as a spark enabler, but yeah, it's still very niche and there's usually better ways to do that. Next we have Hidden Shiv, also a card that I covered in one of the spoiler reviews. Very underwhelmed with the card. 1 power for +1/+0 on a unit is super low impact. The fact that it has warp makes it potentially free, but this is a really bad katana basically, since in the first 8 or 9 cards of your deck you can't even play it for free, and if you can't play it for free it's god awful, and even if you can play it for free you are forced to play it for free right away, cutting your power down by 1 for that turn, so basically forcing you to go off curve, which is not that nice, especially early on. So yeah, not impressed. Might have some fringe uses with stuff like Warcry, pumping it, making it impactful, and then being free and cheap can be kind of nice, or with cards like Quartermaster, but even in those cases I usually rather have better cards in my deck that are better in every situation, rather than free in some and terrible in others. And yeah, limited, similar rules apply basically. It might be okay in some limited decks where the pump and especially the fact that it's a weapon has a lot of relevance, but all in all, very low impact. Even when it's free, it doesn't do a whole lot. Next we have On the Hunt. I mean, maybe I'm evaluating this card wrong. Time will tell that. Maybe it's better than it looks, but generally I would say the card is really bad, since you're basically investing 3 power, 2 cards on the hunt itself, plus your next draw step, and 2 turns early on to set up this guy. Sure, we get a 4/4 charge, which is really strong, but yeah, all the opponent needs is like a Permafrost, a Vanquish, an Annihilate, stuff like that, or just a 4 power unit, like for example a Champion of Fury that's fully enhanced, and then they trade 1 card against 2 of your cards, and 1 to 2 power against 3 of your power, and they basically gain advantage on you in terms of tempo and in terms of card advantage, and that's really not what you want, especially in constructed. I think in limited it might be a bit better because it's less likely for the opponent to deal with this well, and if you have this turn 1, turn 2, it can be really powerful, but even there I doubt it's gonna be too good. So yeah, don't put this in your constructed decks. Next we have Pummel. This is kind of an interesting one. It's basically a bad Finest Hour. We jokingly started calling it Fine Hour. The downsides are twofold. First of all, it only works on an attacking unit, which is a big deal against, for example, relic weapons. You can't protect units against relic weapons with Pummel, like with Finest Hour. And the other downside is very obvious. It only gives +2/+2 rather than +3/3. But since this is fire, you can't fully compare these cards because it's a different faction, and this faction doesn't have Finest Hour, and unless you're Rakano, you're not gonna have access to Finest Hour. Plus, to make up for the downsides, we get what we in Magic would call Scry 1. We get to look at the top card of our deck and can either keep it there or put it on the bottom if it sucks. So it gives us some selection to make up for the downsides. I think the pure fact that it costs 1 and is the first reasonable combo trick for 1 in Fire makes this decent in Constructed and also in Limited. In Limited, even like Rampage is decent, so this is definitely going to be decent in an aggressive Limited deck as well. And yeah, in Constructed, I think this will see play. It has its uses. The bigger your units are, the better Pummel becomes, basically. In a Jido type deck with all like 1-drops that have 1 and 2 health, Pummel is usually not gonna make enough of a difference in most combat scenarios to be good enough. But in say decks that have units that have 2+ health mostly, like 2 or 3 health, Pummel can often make the difference between your unit dying and surviving, and also the opponent's unit dying and surviving. Next we have Young Gun. Nothing special, nothing impressive. 1/1 for 1. Has quick draw. Can be useful, but usually 1/1s for 1, even with quick draw, are not what we care about in Limited or Constructed. So not much to see here. Next we have Blink Wolf. I think in Constructed this is gonna be pretty useless, because I think in general most warp cards are pretty bad in Constructed, because there's only this one time frame window where you get to warp them, and most of the warp cards are overcosted or underpowered. So having most warp cards in your deck will make your deck worse on average, I think. But yeah, Blink Wolf in Limited is pretty nice. A 2/1 for 2 is not awful if you have to play it regularly, but if you get to warp this, the impact is really big in Limited. So this is probably a decent Limited card. Next we have Smith's Hammer, basically ornate katana that gives overwhelm rather than draws a card, which is about as bad as it sounds. Like, the good thing about ornate katana is, for the little stats that it gives, it is free, and +2/+0 is enough stats that it matters usually, especially on quick draw overwhelm units. But giving overwhelm instead of drawing a card is pretty bad in my opinion. And yeah, I don't think this is Constructed playable, and I also think it's probably not very good in Limited. But it might be a filler in Limited in some cases. Next we have Granite Ring. This card seems fairly bad to me. Like, it's just too slow. Basically you invest 3 power to get nothing, and then you invest another 3 power to get a temporary +1/+0 and overwhelm. I think in Constructed these rings are all unplayable. Way too slow, way too little effect. In Limited, this ring might be a filler option to like break a stall in the late game or whatever. It's kind of a really bad overrun effect. But even there I'm very skeptical. Like, the tempo loss is so big, the card is basically a 6-drop and doesn't do a whole lot for 6 either. I don't like it. Like, I don't want to put this in my Limited decks, but it might at least be an okay 45th card sometimes or something. We'll see. Would have to try it, but my hopes are very low. Next we have Grenade. This is basically works like Combust. We have to sacrifice one of our own units in order to deal 3 damage to an enemy unit and 3 to that player. So it's basically a more expensive puncturing shot, and unfortunately a really bad one. I'm very sad that they did it the way they did. I mean, it's 1 more expensive than puncturing shot, deals 1 more damage to both sources, but it's not even a fast spell, and we have to sacrifice a unit. Like, how is 1 power more and sacrificing a unit justifiable to get 1 more damage on the unit and the player? I don't get it. Like, if it would cost 2, it would at least be a card that would be interesting and worth trying or considering. But given that it costs 3 and a unit and only deals 3 to both parties, it's just bad. And also the fact that it's not a fast spell. Like, this card is basically unplayable. Like, even in limited, it's really bad. You need a lot of free sec fodder for this to be okay, and even then it's only okay because it's so expensive for so little effect and so inflexible due to being a spell rather than a fast spell. Really disappointed by this card. I think they could have pushed this card more, and it would still not have been a great card, but at least an interesting card. This way it's just garbage in my opinion. Like, I mean, compare this to Combust. Combust costs 1 and straight up kills a unit unconditionally for sacrificing one of your units. That's a good trade-off, and that's even a common. This is a non-common. Next we have another overcosted warp card. Costs 3, not even a fast spell, deals 2 damage to a source of your choice. Not impressed. Think this card could have easily cost 2 and would have still been meh, but at least worth considering. This way it's just bad. Like, in limited you're gonna put it in your deck still. It's sort of removal. It has the chance to 2-for-1 the opponent. It's okay, but it's not great. And I constructed it's unplayable. I think at 2 it would be reasonable and still far from powerful. Or at least make it fast spell. Like, there's once again these things. They could have reduced the cost and or in addition made it a fast spell to make it an appealing card for constructed. That is still not that good, because keep in mind dealing 2 damage does not kill a lot of relevant cards in constructed other than 1-drops, which is why cards like Puncturing Shot see so little play. Next we have Jawbone Hatchet, another very unfortunate card. I mean, it is kind of decent-ish, since the relic weapon options, especially the cheap relic weapon options in fire, are limited. So this is a chance at a 3-power 3/3 relic weapon in fire, which is decent. So in limited this card is actually probably a powerhouse. In constructed it might be interesting in an aggressive deck if we need some relic weapons, although there is a lot of competition from Charge Chain Flails, flexibility, upwards and downwards the curve, compared to this, and not requiring you to spark to actually work. But yeah, getting a 3/3 weapon for 3 can kill a lot of stuff while surviving and killing something else again, and being buffed by Warcry beforehand. So this is a card that is at least constructed level quality and might show up in some main deck or sideboards in constructed to solve some problems for aggressive fire decks. Next we have Sparkbot. This is basically a bad assembly line, but it's still not completely useless or uninteresting. First of all, because we can only play 4 assembly line in assembly line decks. Second of all, it's still 2 bodies for 1 card. This could still be interesting in some less aggressive go wide decks that still are able to trigger the spark reasonably well, or something like, say, Callus. We get a 1/4 for 3, and that brings a 1/1, so it's basically like a bad grenade in drone. We get +3 health for 2 more power, and the grenade in generation becomes conditional. But yeah, in limited this card is probably very reasonable, and even in constructed it might show up somewhere as like go wide type support. Next we have Stonescar Excavator, another 3-cost relic that is super slow. Here, once per turn, you may pay 4 and discard a power card to deal 1 damage to the enemy player for each power card in your void. So yeah, it doesn't even hit units, it costs 4 to activate to hit the enemy player, and you need a lot of power to discard to it, and also a lot of power in your void. So yeah, I think this card is terrible. Way too expensive in terms of power to activate, then also every time costing a card every time you activate it. So if you don't have power cards to discard, you cannot even activate it. So I don't know what they were thinking with this design. I think it's way too restrictive. The discard should be optional at least. The activation should maybe only cost 3. And even then it would take a lot of work to get enough power cards in your void for this to do enough. I think this card is terrible in both formats, and not even worth trying to break and construct it, or breakable and construct it, because of what I just said. There's so many things wrong with it. Next we have Stone Shaker. This is kind of a weird card. 3 power 1/1 that reduces the cost of each unit in the deck by 1, which is most likely nothing that deck cares about enough to invest into a 3 power 1/1, but this is the type of effect that it's worth keeping in mind that it exists, because extensive cost reduction like this always has the potential to be broken in a way, and this also has nice synergy with warp units, since making them cheaper makes it easier and more likely that you draw them in a time frame where you can warp them in a time frame where you can actually pay their cost to warp, and you're not drawing them, have them on top of your deck when you don't have enough power yet and stuff. So yeah, both in limited and constructed right now I'd say no, but keep it in mind, might be an effect that is interesting down the line. Next we have Twin Barrel. An interesting new weapon, the first weapon that we see that doesn't give any stats at all, only a battle skill, in this case double damage, which virtually gives us stats because it basically gives the unit plus X plus 0, where X is their attack, except for the upside of if it gets pumped later. Otherwise, the pump effect is also doubled. So this can be kind of decent, since for 3 it's not that bad. Like if you put it on a big unit, or like on a bigger flyer, or on a quick draw unit, this can do some decent work. The problem is that it's often gonna be on average worse than a weapon would be that gives like a weapon that gives like plus 3+3, or like plus 3+0 or something like that, because the units need to be big enough for the double damage to matter, and 3 is a lot. And yeah, so far I didn't come up with a place where I want to use it, but it's at least like a fairly unique thing so far that is interesting to keep in mind. But yeah, probably there will too many bad targets for this weapon in an aggressive deck, so that you usually prefer a weapon that gives straight up stats than Twin Barrel, even though there will be some cards where Twin Barrel is better, probably. And in limited, this might be quite decent, since it provides a lot of stat boost, especially on a flyer, and or on like a quick draw unit. Like imagine putting this on some quick draw unit. Next we have Audacious Bandit. Sorry, had to sneeze. Alright. Audacious Bandit, clearly not a constructed card. 4 power 4/2. At first glance not impressive for limited either, but thanks to the Spark quick draw, it actually I think is a very solid limited card. Basically getting a 4 power 4/2 quick draw if your deck is good enough at sparking is pretty good actually in limited, in my opinion. So this is a pretty solid limited card. Next we have another really bad card, 4 power 5/1, already really bad stats. And on top of that, the Spark is pretty low impact. It puts a firebomb in the enemy player's deck, That's not even very impressive in 45 card limited decks. I would not want this anywhere near any of my decks, constructed or limited. Next we have Groundbreaker. Talked about this in the spoiler video already a lot. This is finally the 4-drop that Fire has been waiting for. Now Fire finally has a good universal 4-drop. Very restrictive at triple Fire, so you have to be triple Fire, even if you're like 2 or more factions, to be able to support this really well. But 6 health for 4-drop is really good and really hard to stop. It can attack and block really well against most units. The 3 attack is less bad than it looks, because if you spark it, it has double damage, so it has virtually 6 attack. One of the downsides is that the 3 attack makes it die to suffocate, but the upside is the 3 attack makes it survive vanquish. So there is this trade-off here. This dies to suffocate rather than to vanquish like other 4-drops. And to be fair, there's usually more vanquishes than suffocate, so this should be a slight upside overall. And the enemy player can't gain health. Is really nice against more defensive decks. In red aggressive decks where you trying to like be aggressive and kill the opponent, them not being able to gain health is really good. And especially now that we have something like Life Force, we're suppressing all the Life Force with this card is really good. This is like a prime staple against Life Force decks. They need to answer it, otherwise their entire deck shuts down basically. And yeah, in limited this is obviously also a really great card. Next we have Library Phoenix. Not too impressed by this card. First of all, it's a 4 power 2/2 that costs double fire. That's quite a lot for very little, especially given the fact that it isn't even like flying naturally. It only is flying once it hits its like threshold. So yeah, I wish it was at least like a 2/2 flyer from the get-go, and even then I wouldn't be too impressive. And then the other thing is it only triggers at the start of your turn to reduce the cost of cards, and it only reduces non-unit cards. So you need to be very spell heavy for this to be good enough. Then it needs to survive and not be silenced for an entire turn cycle to start doing its work. And then once its threshold is reached, when your hand is empty, all it gets is +3 attack and flying, so it's like a 5/2 flying, which is also not that impressive. So yeah, all in all, not impressed by this card. Once again, cost reduction might be interesting and breakable at some point, but yeah, I don't think this card is worth it. In limited, I would say the card is probably reasonable, because a 5/2 flyer is much more impressive there, and getting a good flyer for 4 once your hand is empty is pretty reasonable, so I can see putting this in my limited deck. Like, I'm not super excited, but it looks like it might be okay limited. Next we have Outlands Brood, another bad warp card. Talked about this before. Pretty much unplayable in constructed. In limited, a 4/1 charge warp might be okay-ish. Cost double fire makes it more restrictive. Still not great, but maybe okay as like a filler in a limited deck. Not excited about this even in limited though. Although the fact that it has warp and is a more expensive warp card, so you get some decent value for free if you warp it, might make it a bit better than a filler in limited, since I don't fully know how to evaluate the warp cards in limited that are kind of overcosted and underpowered but have warp and basically occasionally read this is free. Next we have Reforge. This is basically a very expensive dark return for weapons. Draw a weapon from your void, it gets +2/+2. I think the problem is 4 power is a lot for that effect, and the effect is not that big. And also, once we are in relic weapons, we often have access to shadow and can play stash, and I rather pay 1 power more to get 2 weapons and potentially 2 more units without a buff than 1 weapon with a buff, usually. I guess it can be kind of nice to get back a Daisho with this, for example, But yeah, all in all, I don't have high hopes to play this card in Constructed, simply because of the existence of Stash. In Limited, this card is probably decent if you have enough weapons in your deck. Next we have Swift Stranger, another new Stranger. This used to be the, I think, 2-power Stonescar Stranger back in closed beta, and was I think a 2/2, and all strangers had charge. Now it's a 4-power 3/3 and fire that gives all strangers charge. For Limited, this is probably pretty decent, especially if you have a bunch of strangers, and in Constructed this might be a Constructed playable stranger in the stranger deck that I will definitely revisit at some point. At some point during my set 2 testing. Alright, next we have Sandoval Warrior, 4-power 3/3 overwhelm, not exciting for Constructed at all, obviously, but it has an ultimate that turns it into a 5/5 overwhelm for 6, so I think in Limited this looks like a very reasonable 4-drop in fire. Maybe even more than reasonable, because turning it into a 6/6 overwhelm, 5/5 overwhelm on turn 6 is pretty reasonable. This looks like a very solid, yeah, common for fire decks, especially more aggressive decks. Next we have Dustblind. Another really bad warp card in my opinion, even for limited play. Constructed is unplayable, and even in limited I think exhausting 2 units is not that good, and for 5 it's terrible, and even if you warp it, it's still bad. This card is just chaff. Next we have Gundown, clearly not a constructed card, but in limited this looks like a reasonable removal option. Not great obviously, because it's only a spell, not a fast spell, and it costs 5, and it cannot kill quick draw units, which are one of the annoying units you usually want to kill, but it still kills a lot of stuff, and that's ultimately what matters in limited. And I heard the format has become a lot slower with Omens of the Past in the mix, so this makes 5-power removal that kills bigger stuff even more playable. Next we have Pit Fighter, so instead of a 5/3 overwhelm we get a 6/3, and it's about as bad in constructed as the 5/3 overwhelm, the Dust Hoof Brawler, and also similarly bad in limited. It might be slightly better than Dust Hoof Brawler, but still nothing that I want to put in my deck if I don't have to. This is a good warp card for limited, but in constructed I'm not particularly excited. A 4/4 flyer for 5 is overcosted and underpowered, so you basically have to warp it to be good. Like if you warp it, it's good, but if you don't warp it, it's bad, and I don't want cards that are bad quite a bunch of the time in my deck. And also if I have this on top of my deck and need to or want to do something else on my turn, I need to forego the warp as well. That's the other thing that is annoying about warp, so you're not impressed by this card. Next we have Stone Powder Heretic. When it attacks, you double its attack this turn. Not very impressive, so it's basically a 5-power 4/4 that makes like pump effects, war cry, and weapons better, since it kind of gets double value out of it. Might be okay-ish in limited. In constructed it's clearly unplayable. Next we have Bad News. In limited this is clearly a bomb, especially if you get to warp it, but in general it looks pretty powerful. And even in constructed this is interesting and playable, and also it enables a new infinite combo with Cable Spymaster, Westwind Herald. Oh no, not Westwind Herald. Northwind Herald? Is it Westwind Herald? No, Westwind Herald. The 5-drop with Infiltrate that plays a spell from the void. So you can basically get infinite attack steps with Westwind Herald. With bad news in the void. You need bad news in the void, a Westwind Herald in play that can attack, and then you play a Cable Spymaster, attack, play Bad News from the Void, attack again, over and over until you attack the opponent to death. And even in some other decks, in like some bigger mid-rangey decks, this might be an appealing option. So far I personally haven't seen any use where I definitely want it outside of this mentioned combo, but it is a powerful effect that might show up somewhere. Next we have Cannonbearer, another overcosted underpowered warp card, 6 power, double fire, 5/6, and super irrelevant summon effect. It deals 1 damage to the enemy. So yeah, a 5/6 for 6, even if it's free, is not impressive. In Constructed it's unplayable. In Limited I think it's not great, but it's okay, because getting a free 5/6 for 6 is pretty good in Limited. If it's not free in Limited, it's still not terrible, but not great. So yeah, this is a decent Limited card probably if your deck is slow enough. Then we have Flame Stoker, kind of an interesting and weird finisher. 6 power relic, triple fire, so you need to be heavy fire, and then you, at the start of your turn, you get an Infernus every turn that you can hit the opponent with for 5, and then it dies at the end of turn. But yeah, the problem is, if the opponent has a 6 health or higher unit, this doesn't do anything anymore, and there's probably better ways to end the game as control decks, and for like aggressive decks it's way too slow, way too expensive and unreliable. So I don't see much use for this, but we'll see if somebody comes up with like a good enough use. There's some nice interactions with unstable form, but even then it's a 6 power relic that doesn't do anything the turn you play it, and only does something offensive the turn after. The next card is Glaive, Burning Glaive. It's a weapon. 7 cost weapons are pretty bad in my opinion, especially like weapons, not relic weapons. And then it only gives +5/+3. No battle skill, nothing, just +5/+3. I think that card is clearly unplayable in Constructed, and even probably fairly unplayable in Limited, like +5/+3 for 7. Nope. And last but not least for fire, we have Sindok, Rage Incarnate, a 7 for Flying Dragon that costs 1 less for each damage the enemy player has taken this turn. Not like for each source that has dealt damage to the enemy, but for each point of damage that the enemy has taken. So if you attack for 5 and hit the opponent for 5, this costs 4. The problem is, if you're not able to attack, this card is unplayable and really bad. And even if you enable it, let's say maybe you are lucky and you enable it to cost like 4 on average or whatever, you still only get like a 7/4. Flying, and 4 means it dies to Mortar, it dies to Runehammer, it trades with a lot of stuff. It's just not worth the hassle, I think. I mean, maybe it is better than I think. I haven't, as you can see, I don't have any, so I didn't get to try it yet. And it's too speculative to craft early on when I need my Shiftstone for obviously good cards. But yeah, maybe the card is just good enough to make it into some deck, maybe into some Skycrack Rally deck or something, for example. Who knows? But the problem is that it's either really bad or really good, and that it's potentially kind of win more like Sangua, like Lurking Sangua basically, and the fact once again that it has fairly low health, making it very vulnerable and not that good at fighting other units when it works out. So yeah, not too impressed. In Limited I think this is probably a bomb, because a 7/4 flying, even if you only get it out for like 6 or whatever, is still gonna be really good. Alright, that concludes my review of the fire cards for today. Tune in again tomorrow for the review of Time. I will do 1 faction per day, and then do like the multi-faction stuff to get through the set as fast as possible and give you my take on all the new cards. So that's it. Come back tomorrow for the Time review, and As usual, if you want to support me and my channel and my stream, you can find a donation link below in the description. And don't forget to like and subscribe on the way out, please. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.